to us for the opportunity to have a conversation. And one of the reasons one of the reasons Charles reached out, just like to echo what he shared, is that we feel like it's really important to make sure that we address and talk about what's happening in our communities, what's happening in pop culture, right now, and how that's impacting us. The loss of Devon, sent ripples through our communities. It created a lot of conversation around intimate partner violence that we historically maybe haven't had as much. And so we want to make sure that we not only talked about that issue, but also honored and honored his life as well, and created some space where we could process what's happening for us, and think about, once again, like as Charles said, to echo, begin to think about what do our communities need, what do we need to support ourselves and our communities, and to address these issues that are happening.
Yeah, I think what happened with Devon is something that's happened to a lot, and I think we have a lot of stuff that's kind of coming at us. Whether it be we're talking about HIV or police violence or other things, and then I think intimate partner violence kind of gets swept under the table, and then I think just the continuum of it and kind of how it's enacted. And so whether it has to be physical violence, I think a lot of people, including myself, has historically thought that it wasn't intimate partner violence until it got to that physical part. And so not thinking about the emotional violence, not thinking about the verbal abuse, not thinking about these things that kind of happen between ourselves, between our partners, and that it may not have to be necessarily between two intimate partners. And sometimes it extends in this continuum to the violence we enact on each other, whether it be through words, whether it be through social media, whether it be through physicality, those kind of things. And I think just when Charles brought it up, and I have to thank Charles on the counter narrative for holding this space for us, it's important because it makes me think as a physician seeing the patients I do see and some of the stories I've seen coming in, but then also looking at myself and some of the situations where I've been in relationships and things have gotten a little bit dicey sometimes, and kind of how I brushed it off or how I didn't really pay attention to it, that was this, because you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm trained to kind of help with this. This doesn't happen to me necessarily, but then when you start to examine it, you're like, oh shit, like this is happening to me as well. And how do we deal with that? How do we address that?
Yeah, I think that's a big piece you said, like it can happen to any of us. It doesn't look any one particular way, right? There's a lot of different ways it shows up in our communities and with us as well. So.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I personally think about the space that Devon was in this time, and being a doctoral student is a world in its own, right? And there are pressures and life changes in a lot of different ways. And so being in relationships, I've actually ended a relationship and gotten into a new relationship during the time frame that I've been trying to finish this PhD. And so I think that, I want us, particularly given this leadership development conference, right, to think about how we, in the context of growing ourselves and building our careers and becoming who we are, how that factors into relationships, and how we nurture ourselves and maintain safe spaces for ourselves in the context of that, and in the context of relationships. So thank you, Charles, for bringing us together. For bringing us together. And I want to be sure that we particularly keep the space that Devon was in at the time that he was murdered in mind as we have this conversation, because I think a lot of our young folks, not all that young, right, but a lot of us can be in very vulnerable spaces that could potentially lead to that.
So just a few pieces before we actually get into the heart of the conversation that we just want to kind of create a container for us. We want to ask that, one, we just be mindful of how much space we're taking up. Like, we know this is something that we don't talk a lot about in our communities. So we don't have a lot of conversations. So I know people might have a lot they want to share, but we still want to be mindful of other folks in the space who might want to share as well. We also want to create a space where we want to make sure we are affirming and validating that we all have unique and different experiences. So this is a space we want to create where we're necessarily debating or critiquing each other so much as being able to hear and be present with each other. Right? And so letting that guide the way in which we engage in this dialogue and discussion by hearing each other, and also being mindful of how much space we're taking up when we're sharing.
We don't want to do introductions. Since we have a small space, would that be good for everybody? I think that'd be fine. It'll be quick. I'm David. I'll start. I'm David Malebranche. I'm from Schenectady, New York. I live down here in Atlanta, and I work at Morehouse School of Medicine.
I'm Yolo. I live in Los Angeles. I'm the executive director of Being, the Black Emotional Mental Health Collaborative.
I'm Keith Green, live in Chicago, currently finishing up a PhD at the University of Chicago.
I'm Wakefield. I live in Seattle. I work in HIV vaccine research, Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center.
I'm Robert Williams. I live in Oakland, California. I work for the University of California in San Francisco.
Matthew Rose. I live in Washington, D.C. and work for NMAC, formerly known as the National Minority Youth Council.
I'm Alex Langford. Just moved to Atlanta a year and a half ago. I'm a writer and filmmaker.
I'm Justin Smith. I'm a PhD student at Emory University here in Atlanta.
Good evening, DeMarc Hickson, live in Washington, D.C., and the executive director of Us Helping Us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Jones. I currently live in D.C. I'm executive director of UCHAPS for the Urban Coalition for HIV/AIDS Prevention Services.
My name is Andre Brown. I'm a postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm originally from Michigan.
I'm Marlon Bailey. I'm from Detroit, Michigan originally. I'm an associate professor of women and gender studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. I live in Phoenix.
I'm Charles Stevens. I'm the executive director of the County Narrative Project.
I'm Mac Ryder, live here in Atlanta, filmmaker.
And I'm Monty J. Wolf. I am the founder and artistic and managing director of Brave Soul Collective, artist, actor, performer out of Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you all for being here. So we thought we would start the conversation by just doing a check-in. Like, given what has happened in our communities, given what's happening in the media around sexual assault, the conversation that's happening, how are people feeling? Like doing a check-in. What's coming up? Where are you at? To provide an opportunity. And when you think about your response, think about when I say how you're feeling, like what's the one word to describe how you're feeling? You can share more about that, of course, as well. But how are you feeling? What's coming up for you?
I'm feeling anxious. I think this has been this time period that we're in has been a great period for a different type of reflection for me, in terms of re-examining some of my past relationships, some of the ways I've carried myself in those relationships, and even trying to understand have I been in places or have I put myself in positions where either I've been violent to partners or even experiencing violence. Because I think I would also have come to a conclusion that I probably have accepted some things and normalized some things that I probably shouldn't normalize. And so feeling anxious right now, especially as an ED of an organization. I want to make sure there's great workplace conditions for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I just want to kind of mirror back what you shared. I love the piece. When we talk about the self-reflection, right? How necessary the self-reflection is for the work that we're doing, and recognizing that we all have created harm in a variety of different ways, right? It's not like we're not searching for boogeymen, but we're actually looking at ourselves and seeing the ways in which we've shown up in relationships, and how also we have to put that in the context of being Black folks in this country, right? Sometimes coming from homes or environments where abuse was normalized, sometimes being in gay communities where abuse and certain kinds of harm are normalized, right? So we have a lot of unlearning, all of us, to do collectively about how to be in relationships and how to be in love and intimacy. And I think that's just, thank you for sharing that piece. Self-reflection is a big part of that work and accountability.
It sort of makes me reflective as a person who grew up in a neighborhood where I saw a lot of domestic violence. I lived in a public housing project, and most people fought their spouses or their families, and we fought each other. It often makes me then think about, in terms of reflection, what is it that makes a difference for someone who sees domestic violence and kind of adopts that as sort of their way of relating to other people, and for other people like myself, for example, who it was, those very young and early experiences of seeing and feeling domestic violence in all the ways that it sort of perpetuates itself, that I'm very sensitive to it now. So like, if I even feel like somebody is talking to me crazy, like, I don't have nothing else to say to you, right? And I may be hypersensitive about that, but that's different than some of the other, members in my family who were the same age as me, who saw a lot of the same domestic violence, and then went on to perpetuate those same things in their own relationships. And so just really sort of thinking about, how do we teach that lesson around kind of autonomy and respect and self-love and protection, and how you extend that to other people, is something that I'm really interested in, not only just from a domestic violence standpoint, but also just an overall mental health perspective as well. And how do we take better care of ourselves and then each other as well?
Thank you. For folks who just entered the space, we were just going around doing the check-in, to see how people are feeling, what's coming up for them in terms of the conversation around intimate partner violence and the sexual assault in our communities. And so we just asked everyone just kind of, who wants to check in and just share where they're at, where their heart, mind, body, spirit is at.
I just to follow up on the self-reflection, I'm real happy that we're having this discussion, although it's sort of sobering conditions and circumstances. But it also makes me think about my upbringing. I grew up in a very violent, domestic violence space, and I'm also hypersensitive. But sometimes in my mind, though, I wonder about that fine line between being hypersensitive and finding yourself in a situation where you are in a domestic violence situation. And how do you know where to stop? Or how do you know to take a step back and say, wow, everything that I've tried to avoid, I'm in it because of other circumstances, So I think this is really important that we actually have conversations about it, because I have experienced very few spaces where this kind of conversation is happening among this group of people.
Thank you.
I'm intrigued by the opportunity. When I look at my childhood, I remember the neighbor across the street was beating his wife, and one of my parents commented, "I can't believe he's doing that in the picture window." So the crime there wasn't what was happening. The crime was that it was being seen by others. And, fast forward a couple of years, I was in a relationship where I remember standing in the door and refusing to let my partner leave the room. 2 days later, I was at a workshop on partner violence at the National Black Lesbian and Gay Coalition. And somebody said, well, if you keep your partner in line, you don't have these problems. And I remember at that point thinking about my behavior just a couple of days earlier. While there was no one was struck, I was clear that I was trying to control and hold everything in place, and had learned a lot about myself. And I think these reflective times are times to think back on just what I do and how I perceive myself in relationships.
Thank you.
I would say the word that always comes to mind in this space is the troubled nature of what's going on in so many ways. I'm troubled that I don't have more tools and more options to help people access the level of vulnerability to talk about what's going on in their lives, and that the only way you can see that the trouble really happens is when it becomes to a physically violent part. And then I'm troubled that I don't always have tools to help them understand that it's okay to talk about it and to figure out how do we get you out of it. And so many, friends of mine who have, some who still are in abusive relationships, it's because they don't see a way out, and that I can't kind of find a way through. I'm troubled that we seem to not have space to access vulnerability, but then to access that vulnerability to build, and a language to build resiliency and strength out of that moment. So, you know, I find that we bring down our guard and we let people in, and we see kind of just the hurt that's been done to one another, but never do we have language to really express a collective healing of that hurt, and recognizing that all of that is going to go away. And I'm troubled that it feels like the only time we can have some of these conversations about where we're at as a community is in response to large amounts of violence and death, and not thinking, what do we need to sustain this discussion in a more healthy way that lets us think proactively before we have to get to the violence. But also recognizing that, you know, to be Black in America, as Baldwin says, is to be constantly enraged, and that rage is felt and painful. And how do you reconcile that pain and how people are trying to express that pain and don't have a way to express it?
What comes to mind for me in my work as a counselor, and oftentimes I have an opportunity, sometimes before it gets to the bad part, but while you're going through the various components of the violence, in talking with the youth that comes through our program, there's a recurring theme in that a lot of our youth feel they have to accept this because either they feel no one loves them, or they have no place to go, or it is a norm. If I want to eat every day, I will have to put up with this abuse. Or oftentimes individuals have some mental health or drug issues, and as much as there is rage and anger, there's also times when there's niceness and joy and well-being and things that reaffirms, well, maybe that was a one-time event, so they tend to deal with those situations because they feel it's not going to happen anymore. You know, I think this conversation is needed in a lot of different communities, but we need to also put on the table, what is it that's keeping people in these relationships, or have the understanding that I'm going to change him, and it doesn't happen. Because, and you know, this is not put down, it's just a statement of fact. A lot of individuals I counsel have their doctorates and degrees. And they feel that they can make a change in this person's life. But once again, Maya Angelou says, if the person shows you or tells you who they are, believe them. But we have youth out here who's struggling for love and acceptance. And they go into these relationships fully knowing that the person cheats, the person's on drugs, and there's a possibility that the individual is controlling and demanding. But these are things that they have to accept if they want to get love. So that needs to be in these discussions also, that individuals need to understand you don't have to lower your self-respect in order to be loved. But the flip side to this is, years ago, we didn't have social media. And then unfortunately for us, we did not have a president who relished in abuse. And then when you put the racism and the bigotry and all of the other phobias on top of all of this that's going on, the question is, how do we survive?
Thank you for sharing. So many pieces you shared, like this illuminated so many thoughts for me, or so many feelings for me. particularly when you talked about the layers, all the layers that as it relates to like, why people are in abusive relationships, right? Or why abusive relationships happen. And I just want to be mindful that like make sure that we are intentional of focusing on not necessarily why people are staying in abusive relationships, but why people are doing abusive behaviors, right? Because like I think that as somebody who is a survivor, right? Like, I'm very aware of the complexities of like, we can intellectualize and say it doesn't make sense in my head rationally. But like when we're talking about relationships and love and intimacy, we're talking about trauma, we're talking about things that are buried in our unconscious, all these deep connections, right? So for me, when I was in a relationship, I look at my own story. I grew up believing as a little boy that I was responsible for my father's anger. And that if I was good enough for him, if I would learn how to be better, that he would not be angry. This is my little child's mind, like rationalizing this, right? Just giving you an example. And so what ended up happening is I ended up inviting men into my life as I got older who replicated that same pattern. And I still was in that same mindset, not consciously realizing that what I'm trying to do is please this person out of being angry and violent towards me, right? And so I was in this abusive relationship time after time, trying to unconsciously work out this dynamic with this person, right? So for me, a part of my healing was one, having supportive people around me who stayed connected to me and understood like were there for me and present for me, but also doing the work for me in therapy particularly showed up and undoing that and recognizing how that connected into the situation, what I was trying to do. It's not always that simple for folks, right? There's so many different layers to like, people use people's HIV status to kind of keep them in abusive relationships, economics, all these different pieces. For me, I know in this context of this work, my focus is what tools do we need to be able to heal and stop the harm? Not necessarily always focus on why they're in the relationship, like the relationship is. The harm is happening. What do we need as a community for tools to stop the harm, to unlearn the harm, and to learn different ways of being and loving? Because so much of what people are enacting is just what they've seen. Some of us grew up in abusive households and maybe never enacted that behavior. Some of us did. It's just the nuances of human personalities and characteristics, right? But the reality is, if we've all learned this in some way, it's going to be reenacted. So what do we need to do to stop that cycle and intervene in that? Particularly as gay men, there's a lot more conversation, discourse, and not even much more in heterosexual relationships. But in Black gay spaces, how are we talking about how we understand power, how we do when we're in relationships and intimacy? Are we having those conversations and getting really tools to like unlearn? Like, I think about that Jay-Z's Family Feud, my favorite line from that, he says, we were all screwed up because we never had the tools. And I think in that moment, he's talking about like, we as men, as Black folks, we didn't have the tools to learn how to love differently, to be differently. So what we did is what we saw modeled, which was often power, control, abuse, silencing, all those different pieces. So we all have a lot of unlearning to do.
Well, I thought about, like, I don't know if the root of it is different, right? If the root of what causes someone to physically abuse a partner is different from what causes someone to stay in a relationship, right? I think it is the emotional, the trauma, the history, all of that, right? It's still the same. And I think the other piece of that is that we oftentimes, and I'll use I statements there, we oftentimes bond with people based on that, right? So we didn't go into it thinking this is going to be an abusive situation, but we go into it, because I'm attracted to the control that this person brings, the aura, air of control that this person brings, and I want that for myself, right? Or vice versa. This person needs me or wants me to be controlling, and so we connect or bond on that, right? For the same emotional kinds of reasons, and then it just goes awry. And I think we have to really, I think you said it earlier, it doesn't necessarily start like that, right? It's a cycle, it's a process that leads to the abuse, but oftentimes it's that thing that we want to address, really, that's the same on both sides.
I love what you said, because like the context is so important. It's not like when people talk about IPV, like why didn't you just leave, or why doesn't he just leave? It's like somebody just hits you out of the blue. This is like someone you developed a really deep, intimate relationship with. Sometimes there is safety issue. Always like this whole context operating that makes it much more traumatic than just like somebody just out the blue who I can have a rational, quote unquote, intellectual, purely relationship with, right? And that's a really important piece of it. There's all this other stuff there.
And I just want us to make sure that we also think about some of these relationships are mutually abusive. So it's not they're looking on each other's ass. I mean, there's a back and forth. And so it's not always a one-way abuser, abusee, or abuser victim, but they're abusing each other because it's also part of an environment of abuse. Different kinds of abuse, different forms of it. And so I think we also have to kind of think about those kinds of dynamics as well.
The piece I would say to that, and a lot of PV advocates often say to that piece about the mutual combat discourse, is that particularly with gay men, I think it shows up a lot. There are a lot of advocates who would say that generally when you look at a particular situation, you can see someone who's operating as a primary aggressor. And it's a difference between like a violent response to somebody's initial kind of aggression and violence. Like that makes sense. So like for instance, if I'm an abused partner in a relationship where like, my partner controls everything, controls my home, controls my car, and then I do something abusive where I hit them, that my violence to that person operates in context, right? So just being clear that we're not equalizing it because some harm can be very nuanced. It's very nuanced, a lot of context, and I just want to be mindful because like sometimes I hear this with a lot of brothers. They be like, "Well, we just two guys fighting. Why I care about them beating each other up?" You know what I mean? Like it's not intimate partner violence. Both of them are two dudes. I just let them go duke it out. And like that, that's why I get really kind of reticent about the mutual combat discourse because like I'm just like, no, that's not okay. It's not acceptable. Like we are like I think our culture engenders us to kind of like see Black men's pain is not as bad or to like be desensitized to it, particularly Black gay men's pain. And I think we just need to like be mindful of that piece.
I think for me, I always thought I was special because I've managed not to be attracted to extremely hypermasculine men. Like I always thought, okay, so because I'm not attracted to that, but I found myself in relationships with men where even though they weren't like sort of like stereotypically hypermasculine, they still embodied a lot of the qualities and characteristics of some of the men and boys that had like traumatized me before had. And even the feeling like, the feeling of associating love with anxiety or associating love with not feeling safe or associating love with shame. And just accepting like, I had this revelation just this year about some of those past experiences and naming them as abusive and being terrified of that because it showed me something about myself that I didn't like because it wasn't how I viewed myself. Like, Charles Stevens isn't someone that would, like, I just couldn't reconcile that. And when I did, it was healing, but it was also very painful because I had to kind of come through my feelings of shame that like I guess I had always thought I transcended internalized homophobia. Like, I read my little Joseph Beam and Captain Narrative and all this stuff. And then it's like, oh no, you didn't. Like it's still the feeling of self-loathing that comes with that and all those other qualities, it still shows up in the kinds of relationships and things that you accept in how people, like I remember this one guy I dated, I would tell him again and again, I was like, stop calling me names. I didn't read it as abusive, even though he would like call me names and like say these horrible things about myself, say these horrible things about me. And I also couldn't talk to people about it because I was like, how could I be with someone that would treat me poorly? Because I should know better, and a lot of that kind of stuff. And when I did try to talk to people in my life, they didn't really know what to do with it. It's like, so I think that why I'm so passionate about this topic is I think so, even to be able to have a language, to be able to name sort of our experiences and to be able to support each other is really key.
I think kind of identifying where it starts, because like I said earlier, I think, it kind of gets to violence, but like everyone's been talking about, there's kind of a pattern that leads to it. And I think as Black men, we're almost walking wounded a lot of times. And whether that's from a home situation or formative experiences, and I think, Marlon, what you were saying about, I don't think it's kind of mutual abuse all of a sudden, but I think it's coming from two different wounded spaces, and the language in which you cope or in which you lash out may be different ways. Mm-hmm. So some person may be emotionally abusive or verbally abusive. And just realizing that things like neglect, things like not talking to somebody, things like shutting them down, making them feel small, can either lead to other violence or lead to reactionary physical violence, sexual violence, other kinds of violence that kind of come through. I think about situations I've had, and I think, when I think about my father, who growing up I wasn't close with, and he was just very distant all the time, hardworking, all the other masculine attributes, but just very emotionally aloof. And I think about the patterns of the guys that I've gone after, the guys that I've been drawn to, the guys that have come to my energy, are the ones that have that same kind of thing. And then you see some patterns where it's distant, it's emotionally, kind of out to lunch, and then it can become violent when I start, asking for more. And they don't know where that's coming from. I kind of know where it's coming from, but then it starts to form this kind of potent mix. So I think about even the example of, Devon and what happened. The media put it all out there like, oh, his lover shot him in the head. And then I see all this stuff on social media, people saying like, well, that wasn't his lover, or they had broken up, or they had done, there was all this context behind it that nobody was like seeing how this kind of like escalated to this point and exactly what happened. We don't know, but I mean, we're all going through it at some point. We're all walking around with this hurt and this pain, whether it be from what we've seen or from what we've experienced. And I think it always plays out in our relationships. It always plays out. And it takes a little time, but the key is to kind of figure out how we can identify these things hopefully earlier, so we can kind of see, well, oh wait, this pattern, I'm searching for this, or this brother that I'm dating, he's searching for this in me, and we're not really realizing that we're not really giving it to each other, or we're giving it to each other in kind of not productive or sometimes harmful ways. And I think finding that early before it escalates to something really combative or volatile is the key.
Yeah. I think that like asking yourself a question about like, what did I learn about love as a little person? What are the lessons I learned about love growing up? What did love feel like? Like Charles earlier was talking about like how sometimes we associate love with pain, with anxiety, with shame, right? And sometimes we don't spend a lot of time really just asking ourselves that. Like, what was modeled to me about love? What was modeled to me about power, about intimacy? And how those lessons informing how I'm moving through the world right now, what I'm attracting, what I'm pulling into my space, right? Because we all have the wounds. It's not about like, none of us are ever like, yeah, I'm a big believer that like, healing is an ongoing process. We never like say the wound is gone. It's about, I have a different relationship to the wound, right? I'm aware of the wound. And I know for me, like so much of my work, becoming more aware of my wounds helped me become aware when I felt a pull towards someone or something. I'm like, I know what that pull is, and I'm not going to honor that pull because I know what that is. You know what I mean? So that's the awareness piece, right? And so I think that it's really, that's why, the work I do with Beam, I think it's so important to begin to interrogate and ask the questions about our emotional lives. Because there's so much hurt and harm that we're not interrogating, and so much hurt and harm we're often sometimes still replicating in our communities around like things that have been normalized, sometimes around sexual assault, like touch in different pieces, sometimes in which like the ways in which we commodify each other and like reduce each other sometimes, like all those create a lot of harm that creates a pathway for more violence in some ways. So begin to ask ourselves those questions, reflect, and recognize that none of us are exempt. I'm not exempt. None of us are exempt from having enacted harm on other folks. It's about like, how am I taking responsibility for my harm and how am I going to try to repair that harm?
But, in my work, we oftentimes have to question, looking at the abuser, oftentimes that individual really do not want to relinquish control. And they may date 5 guys until they find the one that will acquiesce to whatever they do and stick around. And when the guy says, well, I don't have enough, I'm out of here, that's when you will see the abuser will bring it to the next level to try to hold that person to continue with his control. And oftentimes individuals know it, see it, feel it, and believe it. And when they reach out to other individuals to try to help them escape this, we've become so numb and normalized to violence and abuse. Oftentimes, and I'm not taking anything away from my Black sisters, but there's not enough conversation on the abuse to the Black man, whether he's gay or not. Oftentimes, that's why I know in New Orleans now, when police is called for domestic abuse, they take both parties. Because it's been proven when I've spoken to my NOPD friends that after they get to the heart and the root of what happened, she was the abuser. But because the courts are so lenient with believing what a woman says over a man, they get away with that abuse. Well, I had a brother come to me and say, well, I'm giving up on women because I've been abused by them. I try to be a good guy. I take care of my home. And I constantly run into these young ladies who saw their mothers abused, and now they lash out and abuse. So I think I'm going to try dating guys. I said, well, wait, hold up. You can't rationalize it like that. You have to deal with your acceptance of abuse. And oftentimes, if there were more outlets for Black men, not necessarily Black gay men, and they're going to fall into that group also, to be able to express that, hey, I'm being abused, but I won't hit her because I know I'm going to jail. And then you will really find out that there's some gay men in there that are saying, look, I'm in an abusive relationship too. I mean, I look gay, but I'm in an abusive relationship too. Our society is not really exploring abuse on men. And then when we amplify it with the gay experience, the drug experience, the mental health issues, it's really very complex. But we need more forums like this.
Yeah. One of the things I'm always fascinated by, and I'm just sitting here listening and like downloading, processing all of this, is the whole piece around how we communicate. Particularly, and like you said, not just Black gay men, but bringing it back around to us as Black gay men in terms of like when we meet one another, whether it's to become friends, whether it's just for a negotiation around sexual, a sexual encounter, but especially just, I'm just fascinated. And I think about everything through this lens of being an artist, where I'm like, I gotta sit and like take it apart. It's like breaking a toy and trying to figure out if it's a car that flashes. I want to break it apart and figure out what makes it flat. What's inside there. It makes this. So when I talk to people, whether it's friends, whether it's guys that I'm getting to know or whatever, I'm just always fascinated at how so many of us are just at a very basic level, we're broken. And we're just, again, just like you said, walking wounded, just, that we have learned how to just operate like that. And then, like we said, that stuff has to have somewhere to go. And it does. It comes out verbally, it comes out physically, it comes out in any number of ways. But I'm just really fascinated by the whole piece around communication, or the lack thereof, because it's an ongoing thing. And I think that a lot of this stuff starts here because I think that people just really sit and say, this is how I feel. This is how something that you said made me feel. And people can own, okay, this wasn't my intention, or, say, I'm sorry. I mean, it's like you can get in front of something and kind of cut some shit off at the past before it even gets to the point of violence. But like you said, a lot of us weren't taught that. And we don't know what to do with that. So it's frightening for me as somebody who is an effective communicator. And I feel like I'm speaking another language when I'm talking to people, because it's like, they're like, oh, and, it's like, I don't know what to do with that.
I kind of wonder too, like so many of us don't really get a talk when we're young, like when we're starting to date, like we don't really talk to Black gay boys. Well, I don't know if there are a lot of us in our like early experiences, our early dating experiences, have someone sit down with us and say, you're beautiful, you're amazing, you can date someone that loves you and treats you well. You don't have, even like those kinds of affirmations. Like I don't know if so many of in our early dating experience, or even as in Black boyhood, some of us carry a lot of just really horrific experiences, and we're just not taught that we're valued. We're not really affirmed. Like I think certainly as Black folks, we're there's that experience, but I think there's so many of us just carry, again, especially the Black gay men, we carry this. So I wonder sometimes what would it look like in our high school years or middle school years or college years, whenever we start dating, if we have, if we get a talk like, you're really amazing, this, make sure that you don't have someone treating you crazy, I mean, you can maybe hear that later on, but like even just in the very early experiences, make sure you date people that treat you like you're worthy, things like that. Like, I just don't know if we get those kinds of conversations. And I wonder if we, I think now you get conversations about, you better use a condom, you better protect yourself. We're always talking to protect ourselves, but not things like, you're really valuable, you're really worthy, you're amazing, you're beautiful, like those kinds of things. I think we need to hear that.
I think it's beyond words, though. So I think it's definitely beyond words. Right? How do I support you to realize that and actualize that for yourself? If I don't feel worthy, just you telling me that might not do anything for me. Right? How do we get to a space where I actually do feel that way? And so just two things really quick. The one thing was the terminology abuser. So Yolo and I were having some conversation about this earlier. And I think about it in the context of a person in an abusive relationship may be holding out hope for that person to change, yes. Right? And so Yolo's comments to me earlier when I use the term abuser is that like that isn't the full identity of the person, right? And if we label the person abuser, it doesn't give room or create space for the person to change. But isn't that, and I'm just throwing this out there in terms of like the conflict, right? If I'm in a relationship with somebody I'm holding out hope for and think that they're gonna change, so I'm not defining them as an abuser, where does that ultimately leave me, right? Mm. And then the other thing I was gonna say was it, with respect to like, sometimes for me, like that first argument is the determining factor of whether or not we're gonna work, right? Because I push hard, I can be like all in your face. I'm not violent in that way, but a little aggressive sometimes. When my partner says to me, the first time he said it, I got it, and now when he says it, I really, really listen. When we are arguing or not agreeing on something, he'll say, you're not treating me the way that I deserve to be treated. Ouch. And it stops me like cold, like, and even if my immediate response is, I don't give a fuck, right? Because sometimes that can be the immediate response, right? I have to stop and think like, wow, this is somebody I love. This is somebody I am committed to, and they are telling me that I'm not treating them the way that they deserve to be treated. I have to get past whatever's going on with me right now and address that because that's not fair. Right?
But you will open up to receive.
Yes, yes.
Oftentimes individuals are not open enough to receive that.
That's right.
And deal with their own phobias and fears, and they also deal with their pride, and some don't like to be questioned, or some don't. But the important thing, what is 22 years of taught me something, but an important thing that I sit and hear when we do many voices, and this comes up about the man of your dreams, the man of your realities. Oftentimes, the same man of your dreams really don't mirror the man of your reality. And it comes out, and I asked the question once in the session, how do we date? Oftentimes, we date like we eat. Seriously. If there's broccoli on the plate and I don't like broccoli, I don't choose it. But broccoli might be good for me. So oftentimes individuals are looking for the buff. The person is well endowed. The individual that on the surface gives the impression that they got it all together. And most of the times that's the most flawed individual. Or we will have individuals who are so starving for attention and love, will seek to go after another person's partner. Mm-hmm. Now, it might have been cute in the beginning because it's something new, I'm kicking it, I'm doing it. And later on, the person who they pursued left that partner, and reality sets in, why did I leave somebody that I really love? Here comes the abuse. Here comes the problems. So, as I said in 3MV, oftentimes we have to stop dating the way we eat. Look for the person. Try to figure out, hold a conversation with a person. Kid asked me on a retreat, well, Mark, how does that happen? I said, for me, I have a 30, 60, 90 day rule. The first 30 days, we ain't gonna make no mistakes, we're gonna be fun, and everything's gonna get along fine. When the 60th day come around, there's a little chinks in the armor, either my bad side comes out, or his bad side comes out. And when 90 days comes, what you see is what you got. At that 90-day period, if you decide to continue on, understand what you got to deal with. But normally at the window, you can normally back out of any relationship or understanding or whatever they call it. Sometimes I need a school board to keep up with this youth. But oftentimes, and it came to me as I was hearing everyone, we date like we eat. We look for the buffets, what we consider to be that ultimate perfect person, and pass over a genuinely good individual who will give them the love and care that they need.
So I just want to put a call out to create some space for folks who maybe haven't spoken, and a lot of us have spoken, self included. Just want to make sure we just let you all know that you are welcome coming to the space.
I was also thinking about, or trying to think through, how aside from being injured by queer antagonism or racism, even when you have been modeled a healthy relationship. In our culture, violence is sexy. So even if we are, we've been healing, or we're on this process or this journey of healing, or we feel like we've healed, or we feel like we haven't been injured in any serious way outside of being Black and gay. There's something about violence in this culture that is attractive. And how do we distinguish from the sexiness of, roughness and masculinity, whatever that may mean, and violence and abuse? I think oftentimes in my relationship, at least in my relationships, people don't know the difference between what is sexy insofar as what is rough or what is just what is rough, and then versus what is actually like abuse. And how do we think through that? How do we make sure that we're distinguishing that line? I remember someone telling me like, yeah, I'm gonna have sex like you're raping me. I'm sorry, but we really cannot. and we need to be very clear why we cannot. And understand that that's not sexy. And I get where you're going, but how can we recourse or detour or reimagine sexy outside of?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about what is masculinity without toxicity. I've been, going through that journey for probably about 2 years now. And do I have a clear definition? No, hell no. But I think that it's a constant thing for us to think through of like, what does it mean to be in a relationship? What does it mean to love and not have those toxic pieces, added within it? What is it? What does it mean to accept people for who they really are? Whoever you're dating, but also whoever you're in community with as well, because I think that's also like a piece of it. It's not just like the person that you're sexually intimate with, it's also the person, the people that are around you on a regular day basis. Because I also feel like there's a way in which that influences what you think is also okay. And then trying to say like, no, because I have a person that has abused an intimate partner before, and I also had to think them through, why did I do that? Why did I think that was okay? Why did I think any of my friends thought it was okay? And why did we, and then really just talk through, right? And having really hard conversations with, and then to talk to younger folks about why it's not okay to have, and to talk to other people that were previous partners of the violence that they had either done towards me or had wanted me to do towards them was not okay, right? That's a lot of talking and a lot of conversation and a lot of going through very, very tough situations and breaking them down. But that is a part of the work. One of my good friends said, he's like that is just as important as any other work that you will do, right? Is breaking down what that masculinity is, what it means to be in love, what does it mean to be in a relationship outside of the sexual intercourse? Like what does that actually look like for you? What does it mean to have those conversations? What does it mean to have very hard conversations and not want to put your hands in, or like not put your hands on someone else, or like want to do bodily damage to you or you know, yourself, right? Like what does it mean to really go through all of that? And that's like a constant, and it's not this thing like was like, oh, I can just go back to it. I have to like constantly like revisit this, like how in which we are trying to do that.
Thank you so much for the piece. And I was thinking about as you're talking, like this conversation and skills building too, right? And so like this is a great segue. One of the things I thought about, and I just want to say real briefly, is like, so for like 3 years, I worked with men who had battered their partners as a counselor, family intervention counselor. And what I learned in that time was all the brothers who were in that space with me, because the group that I did was all African American men. Those brothers looked like me. Well, could be my father, my uncle, whoever, right? And some of them committed to the work of behavior change and did a lot of work on themselves and stopped harming folks, and some folks did not, right? And so that's one of the reasons I'm really mindful about it. Because I think when we start really looking at harm and abuse, we'll find ourselves all reflected in that mirror in some shape, form, or fashion. A lot of times we can be like, oh, that's not me. Well, we've all lived in a society where it's rooted in violence and harm. And so there's ways in which we all show up in there. And I think we all have the opportunity to do work. But I think our key work is to want to stop harm when we see it happening, regardless of whether somebody says they're going to work on themselves or not. The harm needs to stop. We figure out how we stop the harm, and how do we support ourselves and like doing the consistent work to engage whatever harm we're engaging in those pieces. But that being said, I want to kind of segue to our next question. Like we talked a lot about we talked about how we're feeling right now, where people expressed a lot, and we feel troubled, we're feeling anxious, a lot of concerns. So I want to shift us to say, how do we want to feel about our relationships in our communities? How do we want to feel, and this goes to envisioning, right? How do I want to feel in my romantic relationship? How do I want to feel about Black gay relationships and love and intimacy? What does that feeling feel like, and what can we even imagine with that piece?
It's interesting that you said that, because when Max was speaking, I was thinking about, and I see it, the wheel that you sent out.
Yeah, actually, I'm passing.
Because I looked at this when we were talking about some other things within the last few weeks, and I looked at this. I remember looking at this and being like, this was everything I tried to do in my last relationship 6 years ago. Like everything, like, the four around the corner, and then everything on the inside. I looked at every single one of these things, and I was really able to assess, not in an egotistical way to say I did everything right, but I was like, it was a gauge for me to be like, okay, I was on purpose in terms of what I was clear about, what I was trying to get at. Some of it we got to, some of it just fell by the wayside. But speaking about what you just said, I've said this to guys when I'm getting to know them, and I got very clear about this during the course of my last relationship, which was over 6 years ago. And especially in the 2 years after that, when I did a lot of healing, where I was not dating, wasn't having sex, and was really just unpacking what happened and why I made some of the choices I made. And I'm very clear, like I say to people, like, I need a soft place to land. Because I feel like we as Black men, period, but especially as Black gay men, like I'm walking through the world like this. I stay on, I wish a motherfucker would. Like, I'm ready for a fight. So it's like, I gotten very clear that when I come home or when I go to my space or when I go to his space, like I need one place where if I need to fall apart, let me fall apart. Because there were times, I was envisioned as being this strong person, this person that had it all together. And when I had a moment, it was like, you got it, you Mr. Brave, so go ahead, suck it up. And I was like, it's like, this person would literally like sit there and look at me like I was a caged animal. When all I needed at that point was somebody just be like, hey,
Right. I got you.
I got you. Like, you're not alone. Because I was already beating up on myself about work, about the stuff I was trying to accomplish, about money, about all my own shit. And it was like, then I had one more place where I had to contend with him instead of having one place where I could just fall apart. But then when it was my turn to do the heavy lifting for him, I dropped everything. I would do everything that needed to be done and put everything to the side to be there and to be of support. And it was like I never got any of that back. And I had to be very, very clear about why I made those choices. And sometimes standing in that void can be frightening. And it's challenging because it's like you have to be able to sit with yourself and be able to say, okay, you know what, like I'm sit right here. Like, I'm not just going to accept anybody that's just going to treat me any old kind of way because I'm lonely or because of X, Y, and Z. Because, like you said, I matter. I deserve more. We're worth more. And I think that it's important for, like you said, not just the people that we date, but our friends. I met new friends who, whether it was Charles here in Atlanta, and it was long, across long distance, or whether it was people in my circle in DC, or whether it was Keith in Chicago, other people where it was like they were calling and checking on me, or I just had people where we were able to be intimate with each other, not in a physical way, but it was like, okay, I love you, like you got this, and it was like, well, damn, that's what I was trying to get from this person all along, and it was like it came 2.5 years after we broke up, and then it was, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I fucked up the best thing that ever happened to me. And I was actually able, then I still was able to say, I accept your apology, but he was beating up on himself. And then I did what I always did, but it was from a different standpoint. It was like, we're good. Because I really saw him doing the work and he unpacked it, but it was this part of me that was like, why couldn't we have gotten to this? Like, we would still be together right now. And you could have just even met me half the way there 2.5 years ago, instead of leaving me standing there by myself. Because I was the last to leave. And that was what hurt.
The first word that I thought always, I want to feel safe. I just want to feel safe. Like, there's just so much shit pulling at me every day when I come home. Like, exactly what Monty's saying. When I come home, I just want to feel safe. And there's nobody like another brother that could actually make me feel that safe. And so that's what I'm looking for. Whether it's an intimate partner, whether it's my friends, whether it's a group like this, I just want to feel safe for a moment. Because when I leave this space, I'm going to go out to some other shit. And so I want to feel safe when I'm with you.
I would like to feel trusted and trusting. I would like to feel that I can have friends who are either in relationships on their own or single friends. And one of the things, and I lived in Oakland for many years, and I had many friends who were either in relationships or single or either. But moving to Atlanta, one of the first things I saw patterns develop. One of my first collaborators was in a relationship, and I wanted to see if we could have a social relationship as well. And he said, no, we don't really associate with single people. He made it clear that he and his partner made a pact, apparently, that they would only associate with other couples. And I found that to be really weird. At first I thought maybe they couldn't trust these guys, these single guys, of which there are apparently many in Atlanta. Right. But then I sort of came to the conclusion that I guess they couldn't trust themselves with the temptations to be cheating, out in the cornucopia of guys that are available in Atlanta. But I would feel that asking how would I like to feel, I like to feel I can have friends who are single and friends who are in relationships and not have to worry every night about whether my partner is getting involved in some other things.
Thank you. One piece I want to make sure I share, like, so the wheel that we passed around, when we were thinking about like talking about intimate partner violence in these pieces, we always realized that conversation is all the harm that's happening. And so we started talking to people about, well, what we need, what's the roadmap for actually loving relationships? And so this healing, this wheel, which is being revised, and we're going to revise it every year because we get more feedback from different young people, and people like, change this, put this in there. Just to kind of give us a sense, what do our loving relationships need to look like? What skills do I need to be able to do certain things in this wheel, right? So once again, trying to envision, what do we want to feel like? What do I want to feel like in my relationships? Just give you context for that tool. Yeah, but also still want to give people opportunity to answer the question if they want to answer. What do you want to feel like?
For me, it's appreciative. And to be able to appreciate the individual that I'm with. We're going to deal with ups and downs. We're going to deal with what happens outside the door. We're going to deal with what we bring home from outside the door, inside the door. But at the end of the day, if I can feel appreciated, given some sense of understanding, and I can appreciate you and your value and where you're coming from. Sometimes we just need to stop and listen. So appreciation for me.
I wanted to say, you know, a lot of the things that, and I work with couples who are in abusive relationships also, and a lot of the things are feeling loved, feeling appreciated. All those things are great. But one of the things I've realized with the couples I work with is equality and balance is something that's not always sought out in relationships. It's always one person thinks that I got to be the person holding up the house, and the other person shouldn't have to do it. And when that happens, the roof is going to fall in. If you constantly holding up the house, it's not going to work. And it brings unconscious animosity because you feel like you're always doing, or that's your role. And especially when it comes around masculinity, a lot of the men that I talk to feel that I have to be this way because this is what I perceive as being masculine. And also this is what my partner wants because he wants someone who's masculine. You know, this idea of what masculinity is. And I think that caused a lot of conflict in relationships. And the three couples that I'm working with now who have had some really horrendous abusive relationships, you know, where one person's end up in the hospital, is, you know, and this idea of what we consider masculine is really eating away at our fiber. You know, not just us as sensual loving men, but also just as being black men, because we are constantly trying to prove that I'm a black man, I'm masculine, I'm worthy, and then we come home and we got to prove it again. You know, I think it causes a lot of problems in our relationship.
You know, it's interesting when I look at, I feel like if you strip masculinity and femininity down, like you take away those kind of all the like things associated with them, you see it's really about a relationship to power, right? We don't have an understanding that like we only understand power. Someone must be dominated and someone must be subjugated. That's how we think about power, masculinity and femininity, right? And so like with models of like power with, where we share power, and that means that sometimes I'm up and we're sharing power, sometimes you're down, but we navigate that. That is not the models we've kind of been introduced to or like taught. And so we try to like reinscribe these models of power, which often are bent on domination and harm, right? And that shows up in like gay relationships. And like, I think it's so important, I think Charles said a piece earlier, that like, you don't have to be masculine and Timberland boots to be enacting very masculine and abusive tactics, right? There are many folks who you can be just as feminine or whatever, like, you know, and still be doing some of the most abusive masculine behaviors or however you want to assert and frame those things, right? It's about a relationship to power. It's about helping us find other ways to feel powerful that don't mean subjugation. And like, you know, like, because that's what we've been taught, power. I feel good when you feel less than me. You know what I mean? Like, and that's something our culture cultivates, right? Which creates the climate for abuse and violence, right? What other ways I can feel in my power and feel centered in my power that don't diminish you, but actually hold your light up, and we can be empowered together. What does that look like? You know, that's a piece of the relationship model, I think, as well.
I want to feel joy. You know, I think as Black men, we don't have many opportunities, or we're not allowed or afforded joy. And so I think in an intimate relationship, that's what I want to see show up. So
joy. I support that.
I want to feel challenged. Like I need to be better in life and in the relationship, right? So I want to feel challenged. And I think, you know, one thing that we haven't really talked a lot about is, you know, the role of the church in structuring heterosexual relationships and a lot of relationships that we you know, have witnessed and are oftentimes trying to mimic. My partner says that he wants a relationship like his parents and like his siblings, and they are deeply ingrained in the church. So we'll have a conversation now. I'll bring that up and they'll say, well, you know, they've kind of, you know, transcended that. And so there is, you know, there's balance, right? But, you know, at the end of the day, those are God-fearing, Bible-told folks. At the end of the day, the man is the head. Right. And when there's a discrepancy, that's where it's going to fall. Where's that fall for us, right? And that's a conversation we keep, you know, like, am I the head or are you the head? Is there going to be what's that going to look like? And I think, but that's challenging me beyond like the way that I traditionally think about relationships. So to be challenged in a relationship for me is the thing that I need the most.
I want to feel connected and engaged. And some of that is about wanting to feel both challenged and also safe to fall and to fail under that challenge. And part of the feeling connected is my own pushing in myself, because I have a tendency to quickly disengage, and perform engagement, perform connection, but I'm disconnected and disengaged. So it's both a longing for someone to be in that space of connection and engagement, but also pushing myself to develop the skills and the ability to stay engaged.
Yeah, thank you. So I have some of the words that we shared about how we want to feel. I just want to kind of repeat them back, if that's okay. So it said we want to feel safe, right? We want to feel trust and trusted, right? We want to feel appreciated, right? Understood. Want to feel joy. Want to feel lots of joy. Connected, engaged. Those are some of the words that we shared, like in terms of how we want to feel, right? And so the next question I have for us is like, what do we need to get to that place? What do you feel like for our communities, for ourselves? What's the work? What's the skills building? What's the tools that you need? And that's the question. Maybe we won't answer all these questions tonight. But I want the question to be like something you take on. How do I get to that place of Black boy joy? How do I get to that place of feeling appreciated, of understood? What do I need? What do I need for my communities to feel safe? For my brothers and my friends who are in relationships to feel safe? What do I need to create? So we can get to that path.
I think starting off with great communication is the beginning process. If you can't talk with the person that you sleep with every night and say that you love, and you can have in-depth, honest conversation with that person, you're already fighting a losing battle. If you feel that I got to hold back because I don't want them to see me as being weak, I don't want them to see me, I don't want to be intimidated, or I can't trust to tell this person something that's happened in my past, then you've already failed at that relationship.
And we also have to, in the communication piece, we got to explain, we need to take the chip off of our shoulders, and they need to take the chips off of their shoulders. And because we're having a discussion, I'm not trying to insult you, or it shouldn't be seen as an affront, or I'm bringing you down. We should be able to hold a conversation to better understand each other so that we can challenge this world out here when we walk out there doing the morning, not knowing what we're going to run into, or if the subway's going to blow up, or something's going to happen that will change our lives forever. And oftentimes individuals, when their partners are trying to talk to them, they kind of push back and feel the front. You talking down to me instead of listening. You don't listen and try to be more understanding.
I love the communication piece because that's a skill, right? That can be learned, right? So a lot of us that haven't spent a lot of time intentionally learning what does it mean to communicate, and how do I navigate, how do we get skills around communicating? Because we're talking about being socialized as men, a lot of us being perceived as socialized as men, is we don't necessarily get the encouragement to emotionally communicate our feelings, right? So not a lot of practice. You know what I mean? I know I worked with a lot of brothers and they're like, I want to talk about my feelings, but I had never have talked about my feelings. It's just not something I have done. And I'm very scared of it, and I'm very intimidated, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. And so we have to begin to say, if that's me, if I know that makes me feel uncomfortable, what work do I need to do with my learning? What tools do I need to go, what books, what therapy, whatever, so I can learn how to be I'm going to share with you that I feel sick, I feel sad, I feel frustrated, as opposed to punching a wall, as opposed to doing the other things, right? That's a skill, that's a tool that we can build for ourselves.
I mean, from my perspective, toxic masculinity doesn't just create violence. I also think it's created by violence. It comes from violence. And it's a form of protection, which is related to get to what you asked. I mean, I think for me, it'll take me stripping off the mask that I wear, the mask that, and I think a lot of us wear masks for protection. In a sense, we become these people, and there are benefits, there are social benefits you get from it, but there's also things that you lose. And I think for me, part of what I lose is the thing that I want most of my relationship, which is to feel protected. But I feel I'm so committed to wearing a mask of strength and resilience because that's who I've been taught that I had to be. And I think just stepping back from that is, and I've been doing a little bit of that actually more and more, but it is really hard and it's very risky.
You know what I thought about? I think about this conference, and I think about National AIDS Education Service for Minorities, and I think about the HIV epidemic, and I think about everything we talk about with this, and how many studies have been done on this continuum of care. When I think about solutions, like I think when we think of the continuum of care with HIV specifically, we start with the disease first process. So we're talking about testing, linkage to care, retention, being prescribed antiretrovirals, and then being virally suppressed. And I also think about a lot of people have conceptualized violence, if you see it as like a virus or an epidemic or a pandemic, and kind of and they've also done it with gun violence. There have been several studies that when someone goes to the ER and they come in for high blood sugar, they get treated and they get diabetic education. They get the resources to get referrals. A brother gets shot, or brother's a victim of domestic violence or something like that. He gets kind of tuned up a little bit and then he gets sent right back out. And there's not really any of that. So I think about, even if we were to say, conceptualize like a virus, like toxic masculinity or just violence in general as kind of a virus, how do we construct a continuum of care, a continuum of connectedness, a continuum of safety for ourselves, and what steps would that take to lead us? If we say the end goal with HIV is viral suppression, what's the end goal with ridding ourselves or purging ourselves of this this violence that's kind of infiltrated our souls, kind of mixed with masculinity, mixed with religiosity, mixed with these kind of gender norms, all this kind of stuff? That it was just what I thought of, because I was thinking, how many presentations over the course of this conference and all these conferences we go to have focused on HIV as like the end all be all of us? And how many presentations have we seen that started with, how do we feel? How do we want to feel as Black gay men connected with each other or interacting with each other? And I think that's where the work has to be done, to step back on that. So we start there instead of starting with HIV like we always seem to do, and work backwards.
I think it's about being able to strengthen and develop that muscle of being vulnerable. Because you just have to be able to be willing, like Charles said about wearing a mask. And we have learned how to, like, I'll speak for myself. Or a lot of people that I've come in contact with, because I'm done with all of that. Like the way I present on social media, in person, it's all the same. But code switching, Black gay men got, we got the market cornered on learn how to code switch. Oh, I'm this to this person, I'm this to this person, I'm this to that. That shit can get exhausting, because it's like, who am I? It's like that old movie, The Stepfather, the original version, where he didn't know who he was when he went to, it's like, yeah, it's like, okay, why can't I just be the same person across the board? And it doesn't mean I'm just always going to be happy-go-lucky, or I'm going to just be angry or what have you, but just being able to be vulnerable to the point where it's like, okay, I can just say, this is how I feel.
I love what you said about it being a muscle, because I feel like, as somebody who's been in therapy for years, like, I feel like that I go to therapy the Wednesday night. For me, that is going to be what my therapy is. Like, Yolo in therapy Wednesday night. It's like going to the gym. Right. But it is also, it gives me a space where, like, that hour is for me to process all the shit that I have been through, and somebody be able to help me be a guide to support me through that stuff, right? You know what I mean? And like, but it also gives me an opportunity. I noticed that when I'm not going regularly, but when I'm going regularly, that muscle is stronger. That muscle to kind of like, okay, wait a second, what you doing, Yolo? Girl, what you slipping back into, girl? What is this? You know what I mean? Like, that muscle that is stronger when I'm in that versus when I'm not in that. But I'm just like, okay, well, this feels like familiar and fun. Wait a second, what is this? Like, you know what I mean? Like, so I think that it is a muscle. It is skills building. It's all those different pieces, I think somebody you want to say.
Yeah, I was going to just kind of reflect what he said. What I was hearing and what I was thinking was around the idea of vulnerability. And I think as a man, and we talked a lot about sort of masculine socialization and what that means, we're taught that we're not supposed to be vulnerable to anything, that we're tough, that we are going to fight whomever, that we're going to win every battle, every game, every drinking competition, like whatever the case may be, we are going to win because that's what men do. And I think that, growth and change requires vulnerability, because it requires you to do some sort of self-reflection in terms of the things that are not going well collectively with you and maybe who you have going on, but also to sort of own your own contribution to a particular problem that you may have. And I think about my own kind of journey with counseling. I did it like my last year and a half of my doctoral program. And I remember for like the first half of the time that I was there, I just talked about my family. And it was my mama and my daddy and my brother and, you know, all of those other things, because I wasn't at a place to where I was able to be comfortable enough to talk about myself and the things that I needed to change and the ways that I contributed. And so even though they may have borne the brunt of the responsibility for my fucked upness, you know, in whatever way we were talking about that week, I think it also required me to let down my guard to be able to feel safe enough to share not only kind of what I was struggling with, but also my hopes, my dreams, my desires, what I wanted to have happen, and then to also be vulnerable enough to present those things to people and be willing to deal with whether or not they may or may not give it to me, right? I may want you to be have clear communication with me. I may want you to, you know, speak to me in a certain kind of way, or when I'm having a bad day, to comfort me in those kinds of ways. But if I never express that to you because I think you're going to think of me as soft or whatever the case may be, then I never am able to resolve the issues that I have going on. And I think vulnerability, as men particularly, is something that we don't often learn. And I think then when you put two men together, right, who are both unvulnerable and who don't have those skills to be able to express themselves clearly, to one, have the emotional maturity to know what the hell is going on with themselves, first of all, and then to have the skills to be able to clearly communicate for resolution to another person, I think is something that is a skill that we have to learn, and that is something that we can be taught as well. And so that whole vulnerability piece and just being open to change, being open to the possibility that you may actually get what you want if you ask for it, right? It's something that we often we don't do because of, again, all of this fear of rejection that we've had because we've had bad relationships, right? And for me, I recently started dating another guy, which is really new, and I've been in the class, just on the shelf rather for quite a long and before that, I'd done all of this work to kind of figure out, like, again, what I had done to contribute to my relationship failures in the past, and how I could have done better. And even as I figured all that out, I was still scared to share those things with this new guy because I was like, shit, I'm finally ready to get off the shelf. And if I come to the table with, I need X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 he may not be willing to give it to me, and he's gonna put my ass back up on the shelf, right? And again, so, right, and so it's that level of vulnerability to say that I'm okay with that. Like, I'm okay with being who I am, wanting what I want, desiring the things that I want, and if someone cannot give that to me, then that is not the person for me. And I don't care if that's my mom, my man, my job, whatever the case may be. I often find that we don't know how to just be vulnerable and own who we are and what we want.
So one of the researchers I work with, she has this really good where she talks about it. I'm going to mess this up a little bit, but she says, like, when you have two chemical substances, they either create a certain kind of interaction or they don't. You don't say this chemical substance is actually inadequate and not good enough because it didn't do this in this interaction. You say no, then based on the qualities of this substance and this substance, they didn't make that interaction. And there's nothing wrong with either one of them. Both of them are still valuable in a variety of different experiments and different tools, but there's no deficit, right? We've been talking like, it didn't work out with me and so, so it's because I'm inadequate. It's because I'm not good enough. No, it's not. That's not those pieces, right? So just holding that. So I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and I want to, first of all, just like wow,
yeah,
right?
Wow.
Like here we are in this space, sharing our healing journeys, on our healing journeys. Like this has really been a powerful hour. And I just want to thank you all for trusting all of us in this space.
Can I add something?
Sharing those pieces.
Yeah. I just want to say one thing. Charles and I talk about this a lot of times. I come into spaces with Black gay men all the time, and I'm somebody I think who's not even in the room anymore. When you ask how people were feeling and said anxious, I'm always anxious when I'm in a room full of Black gay men because I'm self-conscious and I'm like just in my feelings and in my head. It's all my shit. But the way that I felt when I walked in here, even though I know several people who are like my brothers and people who I feel comfortable and safe with, I was anxious. But the way that I feel now versus an hour and some change ago is like completely different. Like I feel very, very hopeful, and I don't feel alone. Because I've been that person that's been like, I walk up to somebody like, yo, you gonna do this? Can you do this? Can you do it? And like you said, they might run for the hills, and I'm kind of like, all right, cool. Back to, rocking with me. But this just lets me know that I'm not alone, and that's hopeful.
So thank you, because you actually did the second part. I would love to hear people say a takeaway, something you're taking away from this conversation as a way to close out our time together. And like you started off by saying, shit, really feeling helpful. What are some other takeaways people are sharing? I know you said.
One, I want to thank Charles and just check in, and when I was greeting him, he said, "Come on, we having this talk. Come on." I said, "Okay, I'll support." But I received several text messages of people who are hearing us on live chat.
Okay. Oh wow.
And so, we need more of that. We need more individuals who saying, "Look, we got this going on. You need to come to it." We need more live chats because other brothers who can't be here are hearing and feeling in this. So, you asked the question earlier. This is how it starts. This is the building blocks. It may be a slow process, but my takeaway is I'm glad I came.
Glad you came too, Shay.
Just one word, and it means a lot, and it has a lot of different meanings so far this weekend. It's just convening. It's convening. The need to convene.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it's that you are worthy and deserving all the things that your heart desires, and that you have to be patient with that. You have to be diligent about that, but know that it's possible, and that you're worthy of demanding those things from the people who want to be in your life.
I would like to say that I think that besides knowing that you're worthy of all those things that you desire in life, we as Black men are definitely worthy and deserving of having a healthy, loving relationship. Because I think that we were taught so much by the church and by this idea of I heard someone say, I want to have a relationship like my parents. And I hear my friends say that all the time. And when we talk, I say, well, do you truly want to have a relationship like your parents, or do you want to have a relationship that you create that gives you what you truly want? Right? Because you don't know what your parents said. You really don't know. You have an idea, and you have what they showed you when you were sleeping and when you weren't at the table eating with your parents, but you truly don't know what kind of relationship. So build your own relationship and build it so that it can mirror and reflect for other Black gay men what a healthy relationship between two men, and not a relationship between a man and a woman, which is historically not ever been equal, and it does not reflect who we are. So I think that's really important to have, and we need to support men, our brothers, when they're in a relationship. When I hear someone in a relationship, I always say that's a good thing, and support them. And we don't do that enough. Sometimes we're jealous, and we don't want to see our friends in a relationship. And we see our friends get a relationship, we want to pull them away from a relationship. You're not spending time with me. I think that needs to stop.
My takeaway is that I need to have a foundation for the things that I say that I want. If I want joy in a relationship, I need to have that foundation for myself before I can expect that to actualize. If I want to be challenged in a relationship, I need to have a foundation and a spirit that allows me to be challenged and not feel offended or assaulted and to respond or react. I have that foundation. So I'm really taking away from this that I need to have a foundation for the things that I want.
I've been clear that there's work to do. And a piece of that work is knowing what I want. Another piece of that work is showing up as whoever I want to be versus doing something I've sometimes done in the past. And that is, if I think I'm going to date you, a date is different than going to dinner. And no, it's really two people sitting down at dinner, but I put a whole different layer on it if I think it's a date. And so if I want at the end of the day for you to be a friend like the rest of my friends, I need to treat every encounter way that I want to be what I want at the end of the day.
My takeaway, I think, is that, liberation begins with speaking what has been unspoken for so long, and these are the type of conversations that have been unspoken. Allowing room and inviting people to speak the unspoken. I think that's what this feels like. So that's the takeaway.
All right. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Counter narrative.
Yes.
And it's been a minute to our amazing facilitators. Our dream team over there.
So speaking of resources, so Counter Narrative and Beam and CMP, actually, we did a webinar on intimate partner violence actually a couple of months back. That's available. If you go to beam.community, you can actually get a free copy of this as well as an activity. The activity that we did with this is actually free on the Beam's website. You can download that and do it with folks in your community, take it home with you. And also you can get access to those slides that we created as well on Beam's website too. So please use those. That's why we have them up there for.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Cool beans.
Great.